All right, we are ready for another EBFA webinar. Welcome to everybody who is tuning in tonight. We have another incredible webinar, so I hope you are excited for this. If you are listening to the archive, very special welcome for tuning in as well. If this is your first EBFA webinar, welcome. Please note that all of our webinars are recorded, they are archived. You can find them all on the EBFA YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/EBFA Fitness. So just in case if you want to re-listen to tonight's webinar or you get cut off, you have to go, any of those issues or reasons, please know that it is recorded, so do not worry. Again, the website is youtube.com/EBFA Fitness. Also, we will be sending a recording to everyone who signed on through GoToWebinar. What we're going to do is we're going to go through the webinar, figure 30 minutes, plus or minus a little bit. After we do the webinar and the educational side, we will go through any questions. So if you have any questions, please type those in the questions tab on the control panel, and then we will make sure that we go through these. If for some reason we do not get to your question, we will make sure that our presenter has her information available so that you could contact her if you want to get those questions answered. Tonight's webinar, just like all the other webinars that we did in the past 6 weeks, is in association with the upcoming Barefoot Strong Summit that is happening October 26th, 27th in Arizona, as well as online. So please remember, if you cannot get to Arizona, it is online as well. After hearing tonight's webinar, I really do think that you guys are going to want to sign up. I know that this topic is one that is extremely fascinating, very powerful. It's a little bit selfish on my end because I just want to learn as much as I can about somatic experiencing. So we are not going to delay any further. Very special welcome to today's educator, Barefoot Strong Summit presenter, Molly. Molly, thank you so much for being a part of our webinar series.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to the upcoming summit.
Absolutely. So I'm going to let Molly introduce herself, introduce somatic experiencing, and then I'm going to jump into the end to go over the questions. The floor is yours, Molly.
Okay, thanks so much. So again, thanks everybody for joining the call, whether you are able to listen live this evening or you're listening to the recording later. I appreciate your time and your interest in this topic. As Emily said, my name's Molly Boeder Harris, and I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner. I'm also a executive director of a national nonprofit organization based in the United States called the Breathe Network. And we connect sexual trauma survivors with sliding scale trauma-informed healing arts practitioners. And in addition to that, I'm also a trauma-informed yoga teacher and trainer. And I just love to start by sort of prefacing our conversation with a quote that I heard Dr. Peter Levine, the creator of somatic experiencing, say at a training a couple of years ago that really struck me, and I feel is just a really broad way of understanding the philosophy around healing that somatic experiencing really ascribes to. And he had said in a talk he gave, "I don't work with trauma, I work with resilience." And that really struck me. I came across Peter's book, Waking the Tiger, in 2003. In really the acute aftermath myself of having survived sexual trauma. And I didn't have any background in studying physiology or nervous system, threat responses, survival responses, psychology. And yet I read this book and it really spoke to me and really valorized and normalized all of the symptoms and responses I was having in the aftermath of trauma as being truly innate ways in which my body was handling the enormous amount of stress physiology it was still carrying, understandably, after surviving trauma. So that's sort of a guiding principle for me in my work, is to center resilience. Even when we start to think about trauma and survival responses, even those responses that we'll talk about a little bit later that are initiated through our autonomic nervous system, including but not limited to fight, flight, and freeze, as well as our social engagement system. We can also frame those as resilience responses, because those are the responses that emerge from our system, these evolutionarily selected for survival responses that help us get through really, really difficult things. So I just want to preface the call with that. And also a reminder that whether or not you yourself have a trauma history, and we'll talk a little bit more about what might fall underneath the umbrella of trauma, just spending some time sort of wading into this topic, I think can stir things inside of us. So it could be memories that surface, it could be images, it could be that you make some kind of connections here while you're listening on the call. It could be there's a way in which your body feels some level of distress and you don't want to listen anymore. And if that happens, I invite you to maybe change how you're listening. Maybe there's movement, maybe you recline, or maybe you just decide to come back to the recording at a later date if you feel drawn to do so and pause listening. All of that is really normal, and however it is you respond is welcome here. And like Emily said, there'll be some time for questions as we move towards the end of this conversation. So Emily let you know that the summit is not only live, but you're able to join online as well if you're not going to be in the Scottsdale area. So we hope that you're able to be there in person. I think these kinds of trainings can be so powerful, and just to feel sort of the energy of what it's like being in the room can be quite significant. And some of you may be calling in from quite far away, so perhaps you'll be joining us through the internet that day. You do have access to a $50 discount, and this code webinar is what you can use when you go ahead to sign up for the summit. And I'll share that information again, and I'm sure it will be shared. It will be shared with the recording of the webinar as well, so you can be sure to participate if you'd like to continue to learn more. And I'm one of so many presenters over the weekend, so it's a great opportunity to keep learning. So as I mentioned, this quote from Dr. Peter Levine, the creator of Somatic Experiencing, is really the underlying guide in my work. And it also lends itself, I think, to a certain degree of sustainability. If you are working with trauma, you're bearing witness to some pretty intense and also profound feelings and sensations that clients are reporting, behaviors, meaning making, narrative, and so really remembering people's innate capacity to heal and to be resilient, I think creates a stronger container for the ways in which we can support the folks that we work with. So somatic experiencing, you know, I always feel like it's hard to distill it in kind of a short conversation like this. So if you feel drawn to learn more, I really think that the Somatic Experiencing website, which is traumahealing.org, does a beautiful job of laying out the different sort of principles that underline the practice, and going into further detail about what it looks like as well. You can access videos, and you can see Peter doing demos and other practitioners as well working with clients. But somatic experiencing is a body-oriented approach to healing trauma, as well as other stress-related responses. So some folks find their way to SE, which it is often called, because trauma has somehow really inhibited their capacity to live a meaningful and full life. It's challenged their relationships, it's impacted their body processes in some way, or their psyche in some way. And the traditional methods that they've tried maybe have offered some kind of relief, but then they're still living with some sort of underlying often nervous system related dysregulation that's inhibiting their full functioning. Other folks use SE as a way to sort of just navigate the day-to-day natural rhythms and cycles of life stressors that we face, and use SE principles as a way to kind of siphon off the things that might come at us on any given day, to give them the space that they actually deserve, so that we don't end up accumulating toxic levels of stress. And I think, as we're talking about this, it's important to remember that each of us are so different, and the ways in which we hold trauma and carry stress is really unique as well. So I like to bear that in mind as well. There's some of us who can really function really well holding a lot of stress in our bodies, and there's some of us who, for different reasons, the tiniest amount of stress can really cause our system to become overwhelmed. And we'll explore that more in the longer format at the summit, but I'll say a few things about that in just a moment. Somatic experiencing is really the culmination of over 45 years of Dr. Levine's work. Folks don't always know this, but his background is really quite eclectic, from stress physiology, psychology, biology, neuroscience, the study of indigenous healing practice, medical biophysics. He worked with NASA for some time studying stress physiology. He was also a body worker, a rolfer. So he brought such a wide range of experience of working with people's bodies, of working with nervous systems, working with psychology, working with energy, to the practice that he developed. And part of what SE offers that I think is so powerful for trauma survivors themselves, or practitioners of any kind of healing, health, wellness, or person-focused practice, whether you're a healer or you're a school teacher, I think this work is quite meaningful, is just giving people a really clear framework of how it is that our nervous systems respond and adapt and cope and move through stress as well as trauma, and really normalize, not only normalize, but I would say also really valorize the ways in which our systems choose these evolutionarily selected for responses to get us through things that are really hard. So one of the sort of the frameworks that's so important to SE is helping people to understand for themselves, but particularly for the SE practitioner, when they're working with someone, where are those places of perhaps stuck would be a word, but also maybe incompletion around survival responses such as fight, flight, or freeze. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, about sort of the belief, the underlying belief around incomplete stress responses and how SE works with that. But that's one of the things that we're training folks in. I am not an SE trainer. However, I am the coordinator of a cohort in the city where I live, which is in Portland, Oregon. And so I've gone through the training, and now I assist the training, and really feel that it's pretty fundamental these days, given how pervasive trauma is across our whole society, that anybody who's working with humans has some degree of knowledge and comfort and skills in helping people work in a really thoughtful, well-paced, and caring way as around trauma resolution processes. And we may or may not know explicitly whether or not the person we're working with is a trauma survivor, but there's things that we can start to track in their physiology that maybe is being overridden by their personality, ways we can start to track their bodies and see signs for when we need to adapt the ways in which we're holding space. So in our trainings, there's practitioners from a really wide range of backgrounds: mental health providers, medical doctors, nurses, midwives, physical therapists, body workers of all kind, acupuncturists, energy healers. folks that do addiction treatment, first responders, school teachers, you name it. I feel like anybody, again, who works with humans would really benefit from participating in the training. And so what's unique about the work of somatic experiencing and what Peter Levine discovered in his work with clients was that this quote at the top, as you can see, fear-based survival instincts both shape trauma and also inform its healing. So what we have learned through the study of animals in the wild and through also looking at humans and the all of the information that's coming out in the field of neuroscience is that it's the lower parts of the brain, the older parts of the brain, primarily the reptilian brain, but also the limbic brain. And the brain is far more complex than this, but I'm just going to simplify it as much as I can for the purposes of the call. These lower parts of the brain, these older parts of the brain, are charged with initiating our survival responses. And for so long, a lot of healing work was actually working with the parts of the brain, the neocortex and cognitive processing, that are actually largely offline, those areas of the brain during traumatic experiences. So it makes sense that we would invite the lower parts of the brain that helped us to get through the trauma and the overwhelming experience itself to actually help us in the healing process. Because what they start to see, and this kind of leads into this next curiosity that Peter Levine had, is that unlike animals who are routinely threatened in the wild, and are able to live through these really high stress experiences on a pretty regular basis and come through them unscathed, humans are often inclined towards different kinds of post-traumatic stress responses. And there's a number of reasons for why it's different for humans than it is for animals. One of the large ones is just social conditioning that humans have, which we live in a society and in a culture as humans where we are really taught to override some of the more primal responses and behaviors that our bodies will elicit during a traumatic event and afterwards. Anything from shaking or screaming or crying, any sort of large scale responses, or even subtle as well. Another reason why some of our responses, unlike animals, might be inhibited would be that we're still facing ongoing harm. So in the case of a child who's experiencing violence in the home, they're not able to actually complete the stress response, the survival response, because the threat actually hasn't passed. So they have lived through perhaps a single event, but they don't know when the next event is coming. And so that hypervigilance, that anxiety, that constant external tracking of their environment and the ways in which that impacts the internal functioning of their body is going to be dramatically altered because they're anticipating the next threat. And it may also be that well-intentioned first responders do things like restrain people's bodies or give certain medications to calm bodies down or to quell different kinds of responses that might actually kind of blunt or lessen an innate response to an experience of an acutely stressful experience. So in Peter Levine's book, In an Unspoken Voice, he details his experience of a car accident, and this is decades and decades and decades into his work as a somatic experiencing practitioner. And essentially, he details the ways in which he applied SE to his own trauma experience so that he would be able to move through it largely unscathed. And that's not to say that there aren't going to be impacts and sort of residue that makes itself known to us at a later date, but potentially some of the larger, more distressing impacts are mitigated by meeting the needs of the body in the moment, the way the body needs to be met. Yeah, so the book work in an unspoken voice. In the book, he's really basically saying we want to work with the language of the body, the way in which the body communicates with us, and essentially is asking us and showing us where are these incomplete self-protective responses, so that we can actually find a sense of completion and let the body know, not at like an ego or personality level, not intellectual, but actually let the body know at a nervous system level that the threat has passed. So this becomes a little bit more complicated when we start to think about what gets included under the umbrella of trauma. So I'll say a little bit more about that. Trauma for so long was understood as event-based experiences, and we've seen a dramatic shift. And Peter Levine and the somatic experiencing method, among others, other somatic-based forms of therapy and healing, have come to recognize that actually trauma really is a constellation of physiological responses that are associated with overwhelm and diminishing our capacity to cope and to return to whatever is for us a state of equilibrium or balance in our lives. So we go through the experience and we feel deeply changed by it, and actually unable to maybe live life in a way that feels meaningful to us after it, for a variety of physical or psychological or more subtle reasons. Trauma can be an acute stressful event. It could be something like sexual assault or a motor vehicle accident, or an emergency surgery, but it can also be the result or a response to accumulated stress over time. So we see both, and sometimes both are co-occurring for one person, because for a lot of people, there's sort of the what sometimes has been referred to as a capital T trauma, that maybe the large event that people can point to where there was this huge breach of their boundary, whether it's a physical boundary, psychological boundary, or spiritual, energetic, more subtle boundary. But then there's all these tiny breaches and perhaps betrayals, losses, stresses that happen in the wake of that larger single event. So oftentimes people are holding both the event and then the ways in which supports were not made available to them in the way that they needed in order to heal. Trauma responses may be a result of individual traumatic events or overwhelming events, but they can also be systemic stressors. So what I mean by that is that it could be something like living in a place of systemic oppression. So I'm, in the United States, living in a country where there's racism and white supremacy, being a queer person in a homophobic society, being a person of a religious minority, being a person who has disabilities in a society that's not designed to support and include and welcome folks with differing abilities into it. There can be these kinds of stressors that are pervasive, that are impacting a person every single day, that aren't necessarily a single event, but they are actually the experience of not being safe in the world. So maybe there is not such an acute experience, but often there is for folks who are coming from marginalized communities. But there's sort of the day-to-day experience of not knowing whether or not you're safe. So this is a pretty important piece to hold, I believe, as somebody who works with other humans, that folks are bringing their full selves to us. So they may be coming to work with us around an injury or some sort of event that they can report about, or illness that they're speaking of. But then there's this whole other, all these other parts to their identity that encompass their identity that may be impacting and informing the ways in which their body is able to move through the stress, or is having a difficult time with the healing process. So there may be safety in the one-on-one therapeutic relationship, but then that person has to leave that safer space and go back into a society where safety isn't actually guaranteed. So that's something that is kind of an emerging conversation with the somatic experiencing community, is understanding not only how SE can be applied at the individual level, but actually looking at collective forms of stress and trauma. And the SE approach, one of the reasons it can be so important for people is that if a person has spent years and sometimes decades trying to talk and use language to describe and to make meaning and understand, what happened to them, they may feel like they've intellectually integrated the experience. They may feel like they know what happened to them. They understand that it's in the past, but yet their body is still sending cues that tell them in some way that they're not actually safe. And those cues could be something having to do with their digestion. It could be having to do something with their heart rate. It could be something having to do with how they are able or not able to navigate sexuality and intimacy. There's a wide range of ways in which the body may be sending us cues that it doesn't feel safe. And that can be really depleting to people. It can also cause them to question their own capacity for resilience. So by working, what I'll say in just a moment, kind of from the bottom up with the lower parts of the brain, working with sensation, working with imagery, working with emotions, prior to going into the sort of narrative and talking about actually the specific details of an event, a person may be more likely to find a sense of restoration at a nervous system level, which then gives them a greater capacity within their kind of overall organism to actually hold some of the intensity of doing deeper, perhaps more psychological or intellectually focused, cognitively focused trauma healing work. So we're already at 30 minutes into the conversation. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through talking about the autonomic nervous system. You may be bringing quite a depth of knowledge around that already, depending on what your background is. So I'll put a few things up here so you can see on my slide. One of the things that I think is so important just to be explicit about is that our nervous system is designed to respond to stress, to respond to threat, to handle it, and then to live through, move through, and return to a sense of regulation and safety and equilibrium. We start to see these trauma symptoms and responses come up when a person feels in some ways stuck. There's a way in which the body is remembering the trauma, even though maybe the personality, the person's psychology knows it's in the past. The body in some way doesn't yet know it's over, and so is sending these signals that something is incomplete. The autonomic nervous system is associated with all functioning of basic body processes, and as the name states, it's autonomic, it's without our control. And I think that that's an important thing to remember as well. All of these survival responses that the nervous system initiates, fight, flight, and freeze, are not things that we are choosing. They're ways in which our body wisely chooses for us what's the most appropriate, most adaptive way to handle whatever threat we are perceiving coming at us. That said, it's also true that folks who may have a history of trauma and multiple times being traumatized, their nervous system does learn what is the response that is most likely to help me get through this most safely. And so sometimes we see this more with children who are experiencing repeated abuse, that the way to survive is freeze, and they may be more likely to default to freeze as a survival mechanism in other situations when freeze isn't necessarily called for. And this isn't limited to children. This could be true also for adults as well. I want to say that it was mentioned in the webinar something about the polyvagal theory, and Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory is deeply informative of the somatic experiencing approach. Polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges's work, I highly recommend you explore it, especially if you've been sort of working with a paradigm of thinking of just two branches of the nervous system, the parasympathetic, associated with often rest and digest and putting on the brakes and slowing things down, and the sympathetic nervous system associated with arousal and sort of like our gas pedal. The polyvagal theory is suggesting that the parasympathetic branch also has a secondary branch called often the social engagement system that has to do with connecting with other people and finding safety through that. So one of the things that I think is important for folks is they often think that movement towards the parasympathetic branch is going to be inherently a healing place for people who've experienced trauma. A lot of times people assume that a trauma survivor is going to be stuck in a state of high arousal, but we can land anywhere and we can be moving throughout this wide spectrum of nervous system states within an hour, within a day, within a phase of our trauma healing processes. And it's true that some people are going to be more, find themselves spending more time in a parasympathetic state and not in the place of rest and digest and social engagement and ease, but actually in a place of a deep freeze. So parasympathetic nervous system is also involved with initiating the freeze response. And while it looks like the most still expression of a nervous system response, it's actually the most highly charged state for the body. There's the most energy happening in that state. So one of Dr. Levine's contributions to the conversation around the autonomic nervous system and thinking about parasympathetic and sympathetic is to understand that we don't, it's not a binary system, that there can be parts of us that are actually exhibiting sort of the symptomology or expression of a little bit of gas and brake on at the same time. So one of the things that we come to see after trauma is that we might feel like we have a less reliable nervous system. So we don't necessarily recognize when there's a certain degree of safety around us because we have internal sensations of threat that are from past experiences. And it can also be true that we don't actually pick up on signals of danger because we're not tracking for those as well. It can be kind of anywhere on that spectrum of hypervigilance to no vigilance at all and being incredibly porous and actually unable to track and read cues related to danger. So I'm gonna just say a couple more things and then I'll open it up for questions. I mentioned earlier that SE is involved with completing the self-protective responses that are associated with a traumatic or overwhelming experience and helping to release energy associated with survival that gets stuck in people's bodies. If you're interested in sort of seeing what it looks like for animals in the wild, you can, one of the videos that I really love, and I'll probably show a little clip from it at the training, is a video of it's a cheetah who has actually attacked an impala and leaves the impala on their own, and the impala is in a state of freeze. And you get to actually witness the impala go deep into the freeze state and look as if they're not alive anymore, and then actually witness them coming out and what those processes look like, from the ways in which they start to take these deep spontaneous breaths, to the ways in which the eyes dilate and get big, to the ways in which the body actually starts to tremble and shake quite profoundly for some time, and then the animal runs away after the experience. So it can be helpful sometimes to see it happen for animals. It doesn't always look that way with humans, but we might notice in ourselves more subtle expressions of some of these responses of our bodies actually coming out of freeze. Shaking and trembling is thought of as a deactivation response. And the shaking is associated with there's something that's sort of inhibiting the nervous system from completely deactivating and moving from arousal into a more regulated state. I also think it's important to say that we as humans are going to be constantly oscillating through all these different nervous system states, and there's no hierarchy of where's the better place to be. Of course, we feel best when we're in sort of what Porges refers to as the social engagement branch of our parasympathetic nervous system. Peter Levine talks about this as like the flow state. So Peter will talk about fight, flight, freeze, and then flow, where we're curious, where we're receptive, where we're relational. But a healthy nervous system is going to meet the demands of whatever it's encountering. So there's nothing wrong with becoming activated around certain things. There's actually really a lot of things right about that. So we don't want to get into a place where we're trying to push people towards down regulation and deactivation when their system is actually having a really right response to whatever it's holding physically, psychologically, or otherwise. I already mentioned that SE is a bottom-up approach, so it's working primarily with the lower parts of the brain. Orientation is a large piece of the work that we do, which is really taking in the features of the environment around us and doing external tracking to basically give the signal to our nervous system that the space that we are in is not dangerous and that we are relatively safe. And so before we do any sort of internal trauma processing, we actually want to give the body a felt sense of feeling some degree of ease, comfort, and flow. And then that sort of allows us to have what my teacher will say is one foot in sort of the present moment, which is relatively safe, working with a somatic experiencing practitioner, before we bring that other foot or that other part of us into sort of the trauma memory and the way our body's holding it. And that becomes a resource, that ability to actually move in and out while we're doing sessions. Titration is something that you hear of often in somatic experiencing, and titration has just is really about going slow. It's about not overwhelming the nervous system, because a lot of there have been historically a lot of trauma healing processes that have involved catharsis, and catharsis, when it arises spontaneously and organically for a person, can be a really powerful thing, but we're not trying to push for catharsis. So we want to give the body just enough stimulation and activation that it can actually process it and naturally deactivate on its own. We don't want to recreate sort of a trauma response by overwhelming a person's system with too much trauma processing too fast. That's sort of kind of an underlying theme with the experience of trauma, is that it's too much, too fast for the system. The system in some way gets stuck or shuts down. Pendulation is a word that Peter Levine uses often, and it describes really just the oscillation of nervous system states, oscillation in the felt experience of the body, oscillation of attention moving inward and outward. One of the things I often take away from that, he often uses the language of expansion follows contraction. And so just trusting that there's this dynamic movement happening at all times. Trusting that as practitioners, and then we're trusting that and bringing that into the work that we do with other people, so that we know that we can safely go into places that are highly charged, that are vulnerable, that we're not afraid of a person going into a freeze state while we're working in session with them, because we actually trust in the organism's innate intelligence to pendulate and move back into a place of greater ease. And the orientation process that we use to sort of set the conditions for that kind of movement is something that we continue to come back to throughout the session. And then SIBAM is another kind of principle or element of somatic experiencing that people don't often know. Sometimes with SE, people often think that it's purely focused on sensation, and really SE understands a body-oriented practice as touching into all these other channels of human experience as well that make us whole. So we're tracking sensation. We're, as clients are reporting, we're inviting imagery and using imagination as a way in which we work with trauma residue. We're tracking client behavior, postures, movements that we're making, and we're using those as a way to start to explore for incomplete self-protective responses. And we're also engaging affect or emotion, and then meaning making as well. And everybody has a different degree of comfort and capacity in these different sort of channels of experience. And, you know, there's no hierarchy there as well. I have worked with a client for a couple of years, and the first few years, sensation and affect were just really not available for really good reasons. And so we focused on imagery channels, and we focused on meaning making, and we tracked behavior. And then over time, when her body was ready, then she was able to actually start tracking her own sensation, and was able to, in tapping into sensation, start to actually also track and trust that emotion could be safely held in her body. So I know that this is pretty quick, and so I'm going to move towards the end, so you can ask questions if you have them, and my contact information is available to you as well, so that you can reach out to me later. But one of the things that I think is so important to remember, my teacher, Joshua Silve, is one of the faculty at the Somatic Experiencing Training Institute. He said this piece in a training. He said, something happened to me and my body is attempting to deliver me the resources to get through. And I feel like this is so important, not only for the moment of, you know, the immediate aftermath of trauma, which immediate could be considered days or weeks or months, or the first couple of years, because we know that the healing process is nonlinear and it's ongoing. And for some people, there's quite many years and even decades sometimes of really unraveling the ways in which we've been impacted by the things we've lived through. But this is also really important, I think, for feeling triggered, for navigating flashbacks, really. For me also, it really liberates us from feelings of shame around the ways in which our bodies do remember, and our bodies let us know that they're remembering something. So there can be a lot of shame around how it is that we do feel activated, or the ways in which our body sends us these different clues and signals that something's not right, or something needs attention. And it can be pretty powerful to reframe it and to understand, okay, my body's actually giving me a resource right now that's going to help me get through this thing. And then I can look at that later, hopefully, with some caring, healing support. So I had mentioned, you know, somatic experiencing as a lifestyle beyond just navigating, you know, the trauma resolution piece. You know, I had said for, you know, everyday stressors, there can be these things that we face every single day that we are sort of conditioned again to sort of override, to maybe have a close call in a car accident, to have a really confrontational conversation, or even a fight with a loved one or a partner or a colleague. And we might have really big somatic responses. We might feel upset in our stomachs, we might feel like crying, we might feel like our body temperature changes, we might feel really distracted for the rest of the day. And I use a lot of the SE principles to actually check in with how those things that maybe seem relatively harmless have actually impacted me, as a way to, again, allow my body to move through the things that it needs to move through, and to not be constantly accumulating stress. And it could be also that the things that we're taking in through media are overwhelming in the society we're currently living in, and just tracking how those things are impacted, give a little bit of attention and care to them. I know for myself in public speaking, I find SC principles to be really powerful, largely because it teaches me that I don't have to intellectually push through a body experience that might be happening while I am presenting in front of a group of people. It may be that there's a moment in which I dissociate and I totally lose my train of thought. And instead of trying to override it or fumble my way back, I actually will pause and slow things down. And I'll actually acknowledge that I need a few moments to find my breath, to tune into my body, to slow things down. I do a lot of orientation before I do any public speaking, and I find resources in the room. I also bring my own resources like photographs or tangible objects that are meaningful to me to have close by that I can look at. to ground myself if something arises. Parenting, parenting, I'm only 2 years into it, so I very humbly suggest that there's ways in which SE, for me, actually the orientation piece of giving my child and myself time to arrive in new spaces and not pushing my little one through processes of coming and going, and actually slowing those processes where there's going to be a transition coming, slowing those processes down. We had a really horrific travel experience in planes followed by a car where my child wouldn't get back into a car without like a complete panic attack. And I used SE and I used titration and pendulation to slowly assist my little one in finding a way to comfortably and joyfully return to sitting in her car seat. Triggers, I think just having that awareness of letting not only orientation and tracking our external landscape be a resource, but also, part of SE is when we do orientation processes, when we do take in our external landscape, we might find something that we like, that's pleasing to us, that our attention's drawn to, that's pleasurable. And then we might actually take some time just to notice how spending time looking at that thing or observing that thing with any of our senses, how that actually lands in our body. And that can be a resource to come back to if we do find ourselves in some way triggered, because the bringing the positive or present moment experience back to our body actually brings us back into the present experience. And then it also gives us a chance to actually track movement that's naturally ongoing in our body. So one of the key questions we'll ask in an SE session when a client is having a process is we will ask them, and what happens next? We'll give them time to report about an experience that might be difficult or a sensation they're feeling that might be highly uncomfortable, and we're going to give them space to be with that experience. But then we're also going to ask them what happens next as a way to gently remind them that there is going to be movement, that we can look to see where we're having some other kind of experience also. Where's our attention now being drawn? Headaches, one of the questions that we also use often in SE when a client reports about some sort of body process that they're having. It could be something like tears, or it could be something somatic, like a pain experience, like a headache. Would be to say, if the headache could speak, what would it say? And that seems like such a simple question, but that's become a thing that I ask myself every time that I have a question. I find a way to get by myself and to actually spend some time with that question, and then to see what emerges from there. And often some kind of emotion is going to emerge, and then I'm going to be tracking the emotion. I'm going to be tracking whatever I think the headache might have said in that moment. I'm going to be tracking how it's moving through my body. I'm also going to be working with something that in SE is called islands of safety. So starting to for trauma survivors, there's a sense of fragmentation in our bodies. There's places in the body that we have all of our attention in, and they're not necessarily positive places. Sometimes they're places where there's pain, but there's also places in our body where we can't even feel. They feel so dissociated from us, so disconnected, and there maybe is a lot of painful somatic memory there. So islands of safety is a way in which we start to notice where in the body there is either comfort or ease or pleasure or even less pain. For some of us, finding places in the body where there's less pain is actually a really big deal. And so that can be something, islands of safety, that I'll use when I'm doing, working with myself or working with clients that are reporting some kind of pain in the body, is actually tracking for where in the body there is something that is either less painful or there might actually be comfort, and then moving attention back and forth. And this is part of that pendulation process between the place of discomfort and the place where there's greater ease. So I just want you to remember, or take with you, I guess, today, that healing is a nonlinear process, and that's part of the SE process. We use the word completion, but like anything, we might move through many rounds of completion. We might think we've completed a process around a trauma. We might find that some big event in our life, positive or negative, unearths more residue associated with that past traumatic experience. So then we go back in and we work with it. Usually, because we're doing the work, We are, simultaneously building a sense that our body, that our whole organism can actually tolerate whatever is the next wave of healing work that needs to happen, and that we don't discard or feel the need to discard any part of our human experience. So as I say, difficult symptoms and experiences comprise sort of the map of our body, or the biography of our life, and the positive resources and the positive experiences are part of that as well. And we're learning to see that we can hold all of those, and that those experiences don't need to be a way in which we feel compromised or inhibited or diminished in our living, but actually maybe feel that the fabric of our lives is richer and deeper, and that we have a tremendous amount of capacity to hold our own experiences and that of others. So I'm going to take you back to the page about the event that's upcoming. And I know I went way over, and I do have a little bit of extra time for questions if you have some. And I'll bring it back to Emily. Thanks, Emily. And again, my apologies for talking for so long.
That's okay. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. I know I'm personally fascinated in all of the SC, kind of the history and Peter Levine's work, and the book Waking the Tiger. So thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, that should put those in. Sorry, I don't know why it's echoing. One second. Yes, so if you have any questions, please type those in, and then we'll go over those with Molly. We'll spend a couple minutes answering any questions, and then if we do not get to your questions, my apologies, but please do reach out to Molly directly, and she gave some great resources to start exploring about SC and trauma. So there's a question from Jeff that asks if the accumulation of trauma be a factor in the onset of like a tachycardia or different heart-based pathology?
Absolutely, and I try to stay really in my lane and in my scope of practice. So when it comes to like diagnosis of some sort of physical illness or ailment, I would always sort of default or collaborate or partner with a medical doctor. But I think the research, there's abundant research out there actually that shows the ways in which accumulated stress can contribute to so many different conditions. So I would say yes, and if you want further resources in terms of maybe research and data that would be in support of that, I'd invite you just to send me an email at molly@thebreathenetwork.org, and I'm happy to share those resources and the research that would support that.
Okay, excellent. So another question is, one second. Can active exercise calm the nervous system down? So I'm guessing, I guess, forms of movement as a form of calming the nervous system.
Unmuted. Yeah, that's like one of my favorite questions, because so many people, I spend a lot of time in the yoga world, and so many people will direct folks with a trauma history to go take like a yin yoga class or restorative yoga classes that are really slow moving and barely any sort of activity or physical output in the practice. And those can actually, for a lot of people, really heighten anxiety. Spending time not moving for some people can take them into, I had mentioned the parasympathetic state, which can have to do with rest and digest and ease and comfort, but can also start to feel like freeze for people. So, I I think it's important to remember that all people have really different nervous system responses to trauma. And so for a lot of people, what's going to be most helpful is to do some kind of vigorous movement to actually work with the stimulation that the body's holding and the activation, so that they can then actually slow things down and do other kinds of processing. So absolutely, it's one of sort of, I think, the misnomers is that we need to just rest, and that is going to be inherently healing to states of anxiety or overwhelm. And actually moving that energy through us is going to be hugely beneficial. Actually, Peter Levine had said in one of his books, I believe, movement is the antidote to freeze. And the freeze state is quite common for a lot of trauma survivors to experience. So finding ways to help the body feel agency, to feel muscular engagement, to feel heat rising, to feel itself moving in a way that's really uninhibited and free, can actually be a huge, huge way in which we start to thaw some degree of that freeze state from the nervous system. So I really recommend it. You know, we see things like meditation practices being so helpful for people and so supportive of healing, but for a lot of people, it has to be sort of front loaded with a lot of activity and movement so that they can actually slow their body down, because just sitting down for a lot of people and getting still is when actually their anxiety and pain and discomfort and somatic memory may actually start to rise most actively. And people might find, I'll say one more thing about that. Some people may find that they'll see a shift. I know in my own experience and that of a lot of the people I've worked with, they really needed high, like strong movement practices in sort of the acute stages of either just being in the aftermath of trauma or the acute stages of actually beginning to process the trauma. And then over time, as they felt more healing and resilience and capacity building at a nervous system level, they were able to find those experiences that of more contemplative practices, of meditation, of restorative yoga, as places where they could actually tap into slowing down and resting as a place of comfort. For a lot of trauma survivors, there can be sort of a feedback loop where stillness starts to get associated with fear. And when there's fear, they might start to move into a place of freeze, and then when a person feels their body moving into a place of freeze, that can actually increase their levels of fear, and that can grow into terror, and then it can be this really tricky feedback loop. So I really trust people exploring a lot of different practices, and also being mindful of does the practice, what's the impact or what's the effect of the practice? Does it feel good in the moment to do really vigorous exercise and then there's a sense of collapse afterwards? Or does it feel really good in the moment and there's a sense of agency and empowerment in ease afterwards? And vice versa, does slow movement or contemplative practice feel, what's the impact afterwards is a question I often have for folks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a great last question, great summary of how some of the movement specialists and health professionals who are listening can kind of start to explore the concept of SE. Thank you so much, Molly. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in. Real quick, there was a question on CECs. Yes, there are CECs for the Barefoot Strong Summit, NASM, ACE, AFA, PTA Global, and Physical Therapy for Arizona. Again, if you guys have any questions, please reach out to Molly. She gave her email address. Please check out the recording if you want to listen to this again. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you at the summit and we can explore many more questions with Molly. Have an amazing night or great day, depending where in the world you are. Thank you so much.